The rain was falling gently outside the small diner on the corner of the old street. It was one of those diners that smelled of fresh bread, warm coffee, and fried eggs. The neon sign flickered in the night, calling strangers to step inside for a cup of comfort. Inside, the world was quiet. A few customers sat at the booths reading newspapers, drinking tea, or staring through the foggy windows. Among them sat a man who was not like the others. His name was Daniel. He was in his late 40s with gray hair at his temples and a calm expression on his face. His wheelchair rested beside the table, and his hands, though strong in appearance, moved with difficulty. Daniel had lived a life of both struggle and triumph. He had built an empire of businesses from nothing, rising from a poor childhood into one of the richest men in the city. But with all his wealth, he carried something heavier than gold: his disability. A car accident many years ago had taken away the strength of his legs, leaving him to face the world in a wheelchair. Most people who knew him respected him. Some even admired him. But strangers did not always see the man behind the chair. Strangers only saw weakness. That night, Daniel had entered the diner not because he was hungry, but because he wanted to feel something ordinary. Billionaire or not, he longed to sit with a cup of hot coffee and a plate of pie, to hear the rain outside, and to be just another customer. He ordered quietly, thanked the waitress with a kind smile, and waited for his meal. At the other end of the diner, 3 young men walked in. They were loud, full of laughter that did not sound warm but sharp, the kind of laughter that sought to draw attention. Their jackets were wet with rain, and their shoes left muddy marks on the floor. The waitress greeted them politely, but they hardly noticed her. Their eyes scanned the diner, searching for something or someone to mock. Their gaze stopped on Daniel. One of them whispered something, and the others laughed. They did not know who Daniel was. They did not know he was a billionaire who had built hospitals, schools, and charities. To them, he was just a man in a wheelchair, alone, eating dinner in a small diner on a rainy night. The tallest of the 3 walked over first. He leaned against Daniel's table and smirked. "Well, well," he said loudly enough for the whole diner to hear.
"What do we have here?"
"Eating alone, old man?" Daniel looked up, his eyes calm but firm. "I prefer peace," he answered softly. The young men laughed. "Peace," one of them repeated mockingly. "Is that what you call sitting here helpless?" The waitress came quickly, trying to stop them. "Please leave him alone. He's just a customer." But the men ignored her. They surrounded Daniel, blocking him in his booth. The tallest leaned closer, his voice cruel. "You think you're better than us? Sitting here with your fancy clothes and your little chair?" Daniel remained silent. He had faced worse in his life. But silence did not satisfy the bullies. One of them, impatient, slapped Daniel across the face. The sound echoed through the diner, shocking the few customers who sat frozen in their seats. The waitress gasped, "Stop it, or I'll call the police." Daniel's head turned slightly from the blow, but he did not cry out. His eyes, filled with quiet strength, looked back at his attackers. He said nothing. He did not fight back. He did not raise his voice. The bullies laughed again, but their laughter was uneasy now. Something in Daniel's stillness unsettled them. Still, they turned and walked away, throwing insults as they left. The door slammed behind them, leaving silence in their wake. The waitress rushed to Daniel. "Are you all right, sir? Should I call someone? Do you want me to report them?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "No," he whispered. "Do not trouble yourself. They are only blind to what matters." The waitress looked at him with pity. She had served many customers in her life, but something about this man felt different. There was dignity in the way he sat, even after being humiliated. She brought him his coffee and pie, and he thanked her as if nothing had happened. But inside, Daniel's heart was heavy. Not because of the slap, but because of the cruelty of the world. With all his power, with all his wealth, he could not stop the way people looked at him. He could not buy respect in the eyes of strangers. He sat in silence, eating slowly, tasting the sweetness of the pie but feeling the bitterness of loneliness. The rain outside grew heavier, tapping against the windows like 1,000 tiny fingers. An hour passed. The diner was quieter now. Most of the customers had left, leaving only Daniel and the waitress. The clock ticked steadily on the wall, its sound filling the silence. Then the door opened again. A woman stepped in, shaking the rain from her coat. She was dressed plainly, her clothes neat but worn from years of hard work. Her skin was dark, her hands rough from cleaning. her back slightly bent from carrying burdens heavier than most could imagine. She was a maid who worked in one of the wealthy houses nearby, cleaning floors and washing clothes for people who hardly noticed her presence. Her name was Grace. She looked around the diner, her eyes tired but kind. She chose a booth near the corner, away from the windows, and sat down quietly. The waitress came over with a smile, happy to see another customer. Grace ordered a bowl of soup and a piece of bread, the cheapest thing on the menu. Daniel noticed her from across the room. Something about the way she carried herself caught his attention. There was strength in her simplicity, courage in her quiet presence. She was not rich, not powerful, but she had dignity, and Daniel felt in that moment that the night was not finished. The slap from the bullies had left a mark on his cheek, but he felt another story beginning to unfold. Grace's arrival was no accident. Life had a way of bringing strangers together at the exact moment they needed each other. The rain continued to fall outside. The diner's neon sign flickered again. And inside, two lives that seemed worlds apart were about to cross, forever changing the meaning of strength, kindness, and respect. The diner clock struck 9, its tick echoing softly in the nearly empty room. Outside, the rain fell harder, drumming on the roof, running down the windows and spilling into the streets like tiny rivers. Inside, the world felt still. Daniel sat in his booth, the untouched coffee growing cold before him. His thoughts wandered like the rain, restless and searching. The sting on his cheek from earlier had faded, but the memory of those young men lingered. Not the pain of their hand, but the pain of their ignorance. Across the diner, Grace slowly ate her soup. She held the spoon carefully, as if each bite was precious. For her, it was not just food, it was a small comfort at the end of a long day of labor. She had spent hours scrubbing floors and polishing glass until her hands were raw, yet her eyes showed no complaint. She had grown used to carrying burdens quietly. The waitress moved about softly, refilling cups, wiping tables, her steps respectful in the heavy silence. But she too glanced now and then at Daniel and Grace, sensing something unusual between them. Daniel's gaze settled on Grace again. There was no glamour about her, no display of wealth, no pride, and yet, he felt a strength from her that the 3 bullies from earlier could never match. Her face showed lines of fatigue, but behind those lines lived resilience. He admired that silently. After a long pause, Daniel wheeled himself slightly forward, rolling across the diner until he reached her booth. Grace looked up, surprised to see him there. "Good evening," Daniel said gently, his voice carrying both dignity and kindness. Grace gave a small nod, her lips forming a faint smile. "Good evening, sir. May I sit here?" he asked, though his chair was already with him. She motioned politely. "Yes, of course." For a moment, silence rested between them. The rain spoke louder than their voices, filling the space. Grace kept her eyes on her soup while Daniel studied her with quiet curiosity. Finally, Daniel spoke again. "It has been a long night." Grace nodded slowly. "Yes, long days, long nights. They all blend together sometimes." Her words were simple, but behind them was a depth he understood. Long days, long nights, he too knew that rhythm. The world saw his wealth, his empire, his power, but few knew the lonely hours that built it. Few knew the pain hidden beneath the success. "You work nearby?" Daniel asked kindly. "Yes," Grace replied. "In a large house at the edge of the street. I clean, cook, wash, many years now." She gave a small laugh, not bitter but weary. "Sometimes I feel I have lived more in other people's houses than in my own." Daniel listened with care. He had spent years in rooms filled with businessmen and leaders, but conversations often felt hollow. Now in this quiet diner, the voice of a maid felt more real than any of those grand halls. "You must be tired," he said gently. Grace shrugged. "Tired, yes. But work feeds the children. Work keeps the roof over us. Tiredness is lighter than hunger." Her words touched Daniel deeply. He thought of the many times he had complained in his early years before he learned endurance. He had never known what it was to feed children with pennies, but he knew what it meant to fight for survival. "You have children?" he asked softly. Her eyes softened. "Yes, 2 boys. They wait at home now. They do their schoolwork while I'm gone. They want to become better men one day." She paused and her lips trembled slightly. "I pray they never face cruelty for what they cannot change." Daniel's heart tightened at her words. He thought of the bullies earlier. He thought of his own pain. Respect was not always given to those who deserved it. I know what you mean, Daniel said. He placed his hand gently on the table. Tonight I faced cruelty myself. 3 young men saw me only as a man in a chair. They raised their hand against me. Grace's spoon froze in midair. Her eyes widened. They struck you? Daniel nodded once, calm. Yes, but I did not strike back. I could not, and I would not. Sometimes silence is stronger than anger. Grace stared at him for a moment, her face filled with shock and sorrow. She could not understand why anyone would harm a man who had done nothing wrong. But then, she remembered the many times she herself had been ignored, dismissed, treated as less because of who she was. Her voice grew quiet. The world is often blind, sir. It does not always see the person, only the shadow. Daniel looked at her with deep respect. You are wise, Grace shook her head slightly. No, just old wounds teach lessons. Their eyes met across the table, 2 lives so different yet bound by invisible threads. One was a billionaire, the other a maid. One carried wealth, the other carried survival. But both carried scars that could not be seen. The waitress, sensing the bond forming, came over with a pot of fresh coffee. She poured them both cups, her smile gentle. It's on the house, she whispered before leaving them alone again. Grace wrapped her hands around the warm cup, as though holding it for comfort. Daniel, too, lifted his cup carefully. In the steam rising from the coffee, something shifted. Not a miracle, not magic, but the quiet beginning of connection. For the first time in a long while, Daniel spoke of himself. I built companies, he said. Factories, offices, hospitals. People call me rich. But money has never filled the silence of nights like this. Money cannot buy the respect of strangers in a diner. Grace listened. She did not interrupt. She did not judge. Her eyes stayed steady on his, full of understanding. And you, Daniel continued softly. You clean houses that are not yours. You raise children who will one day rise above these walls. You carry burdens heavier than mine, yet you sit here with more grace than many I have known. Grace lowered her eyes. Compliments were not common in her life. I only do what I must. Nothing more. But that is everything, Daniel replied. The clock ticked again. The rain did not stop. But inside, something had changed. Grace felt seen in a way she had not felt in years. Daniel felt understood in a way wealth had never given him. They sat together, sharing words, sharing silence, sharing humanity. Neither of them knew that this simple meeting, born of rain and chance, would shape both their lives in ways they could not yet imagine. For outside the diner, unseen, the 3 bullies lingered in the dark, their laughter gone, replaced by whispers. They had learned who Daniel truly was, and curiosity mixed with fear now stirred in their hearts. The night was far from over. The rain had slowed to a soft drizzle, but the city streets still glistened under the faint glow of streetlights. In the diner, the warm light reflected on the wet windows, creating a quiet sanctuary from the gray world outside. Daniel and Grace remained at their table. Neither had spoken for several minutes, but the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that allowed understanding to grow without words. Each sip of coffee, each bite of bread or pie carried a weight of thought and reflection. Grace finally broke the silence. Do you come here often? She asked softly. Daniel shook his head. Not often. I usually eat in my office or at home. But tonight, I needed a place where I could just be. He gestured toward the room, toward the other few customers who were quietly finishing their meals. A place where no one knows my name or my fortune. Just a place where I can exist like anyone else. Grace nodded slowly. I understand. Sometimes it is easier to be invisible. People see you less and they leave you in peace. Daniel smiled faintly. But peace is rare, is it not? Rare, she agreed. And yet, even in rare moments, life gives small kindnesses. He looked at her, curious. What do you mean? Grace set down her spoon. The kindness of strangers. The warmth of a place that welcomes you. A quiet conversation that shows someone notices you. That, I think, is enough to keep going sometimes. Daniel felt a connection growing stronger with each word. In her quiet observations, he saw truth. People often underestimated the power of small gestures, of noticing someone's presence. He had built empires, given speeches, signed contracts worth millions, but here, in a small diner listening to the words of a maid, he felt something he rarely experienced, honesty. You speak wisely, he said softly. For someone who works in silence, your words carry a lot of weight. Grace shook her head again, her hands folded over her soup bowl. I only speak what I have learned. Life teaches lessons in hard ways. You either listen or you are left behind. Daniel paused. He wanted to say more, but the words felt heavy in his mouth. How could he explain that his own lessons, though different, were no less hard? He had faced betrayal, loss and pain hidden behind wealth and power. Yet hearing Grace speak, he realized that hardship did not belong to one class or one life. It was universal. Suddenly, the diner door opened again, letting in a small gust of cold air and the faint smell of wet earth. The few remaining customers glanced up briefly, then returned to their food. Daniel and Grace looked toward the entrance together. It was one of the bullies from earlier, the tallest one. He paused at the door, his wet jacket clinging to him. For a moment, the diner seemed to hold its breath. Daniel's eyes met his across the room. Calm, steady, unafraid. The man had expected fear, perhaps even a reaction of anger, but he found none. The bully's smirk faltered. He had been sure that humiliation would follow Daniel everywhere, but instead he saw a man who refused to be diminished. He hesitated, then stepped inside, looking around. His friends were nowhere in sight. The waitress noticed him immediately. "Sir," she said cautiously, "please do not cause trouble. You were asked to leave before?" The young man ignored her, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Daniel again. Then unexpectedly his gaze shifted to Grace. Something flickered in his expression. Curiosity, confusion, perhaps even a hint of guilt. Daniel, noticing the momentary pause, said nothing. He did not need to speak. Grace, too, remained calm. She had faced scorn and dismissal many times before, and the presence of a stranger with ill intent no longer frightened her. Finally, the man turned and left without a word. The sound of the door closing echoed, leaving only the soft rain outside and the quiet hum of the diner. Grace exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing. "That was unexpected," Daniel nodded. "Yes, but it also reminds us that courage does not always need to shout." She smiled faintly. "You speak as if you know courage well." "I do," he replied. "I have learned that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the choice to act with dignity despite it." Grace's eyes softened. She felt the truth in his words. Her own life was full of silent acts of courage. Walking into wealthy homes, raising children alone, facing daily struggles. No one saw the bravery it took to keep going, but she knew it. And now someone across the table understood it too. The waitress returned to refill their cups, giving them a gentle smile. She seemed to sense that something meaningful had passed between the two strangers. As the minutes stretched, Daniel began to speak of his life. Not of wealth or titles, but of experiences that shaped him. "When I was younger," he said, "I thought success meant having everything. Money, power, influence. But over the years I realized that the most valuable things are not things at all. They are moments of honesty, of connection, of being seen for who you are." Grace listened intently, nodding. "Yes, that is true. Many people go through life looking at the surface, never seeing what lies beneath. I have learned to notice what is real, even if it is quiet." Daniel smiled faintly. "And you have noticed me even now? That is more valuable than you can imagine." Grace shook her head humbly. "I only see what is before me. You sitting here alone after what happened, it is difficult not to see you." He looked down at his hands, then back at her. "It is rare to be seen without judgment. Perhaps because the world fears what it does not understand," she said softly. Daniel's eyes glistened slightly. "Yes, Aaron. And yet even in a world that fears difference, kindness can appear where you least expect it. In small gestures, in words, in the way someone simply notices another person." Grace's gaze dropped to her soup again, thinking of her two boys waiting at home. She imagined teaching them these lessons, that courage and kindness could be stronger than cruelty, that dignity could outshine power. Daniel continued, his voice gentle but steady. "Tonight I have learned that lesson once again. Not from my wealth, not from my achievements, but from this small diner, from a stranger's presence." Grace looked up, surprised. "You see me as a stranger?" "Perhaps," Daniel said, "but not as someone unknown. I see strength in you, and in that strength I see truth." Her lips curved into a small, shy smile. "Then you are kind to notice." The rain outside slowed further, now barely more than a mist. The diner, once a place of ordinary meals, had become a sanctuary of quiet understanding. For the first time in many nights, Daniel felt a warmth in his heart. Not the warmth of money or luxury, but the warmth of human connection. Grace, too, felt a sense of peace. The night had brought unexpected company. a conversation that lifted the heaviness of her daily burdens. She had shared a space, a moment with someone who saw her courage, her dignity, and her humanity. The diner clock ticked steadily. Outside, the world remained wet and gray, but inside, two lives, so different yet so similar, were beginning to intertwine in ways neither had expected. Daniel looked at Grace, then at the fading rain, and whispered quietly, "Perhaps the world is not entirely unkind." After all, Grace nodded, a tear threatening to fall, but she quickly blinked it away. "Perhaps not," she said softly. They remained at their table, talking and sharing silence, sharing understanding. The storm outside had passed, but a storm of life and experience had brought them together. And in that quiet diner, amid ordinary sounds and simple meals, two souls had found a rare connection, one that would leave a mark longer than any slap, stronger than any insult, and more enduring than wealth or status. The night stretched on, but Daniel and Grace did not notice the time. Their conversation had created a bubble of warmth, a refuge from the judgment and cruelty of the world outside. They had discovered something precious, the power of seeing another person fully, the courage to remain gentle in the face of harshness, and the quiet strength of human dignity. And though the world beyond the diner would continue in its noise, its indifference and its occasional cruelty, in this small corner of the city, two lives had intersected in a way that promised hope, understanding, and the kind of connection that could endure far longer than a single night. The diner's warm light seemed to wrap around Daniel and Grace as they continued to talk. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, leaving the streets glistening and quiet. The city, often loud and harsh, now felt distant and muted. Inside, a fragile sense of peace had settled, though neither Daniel nor Grace wanted to speak too loudly and disturb it. Daniel leaned back in his wheelchair, reflecting on the past hour. Something about meeting Grace had reminded him of the humanity that often went unseen, especially in his world of wealth and high society. He had faced cruelty many times before, but there was a new feeling now: hope. Hope not born from power, but from connection. Grace, on the other hand, quietly stirred her tea. She had long accepted that her life was full of challenges, that work was hard and recognition rare. But tonight, meeting Daniel, she felt a subtle shift. There was no pretense, no judgment, only understanding. "You know," Daniel said after a pause, "I have spent my life surrounded by people who wanted something from me. My wealth, my influence, my time. Rarely have I met someone who simply exists without expectation." Grace looked at him thoughtfully. "And yet you are wealthy. You could give almost anything to someone who asked." Daniel smiled faintly. "Yes. And yet there is a difference between giving from abundance and recognizing the person before you. That is what you have done tonight, Grace. You see me for who I am, not for what I possess." She felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. For so long she had been invisible in the eyes of others. To have someone truly notice her presence without judgment was a rare gift. Daniel continued, "You know, I often think about power, not just the power of wealth, but the power to change lives. I built businesses, hospitals, schools, but the real change, the real difference, comes from something much smaller. It comes from seeing someone, acknowledging them, giving them respect when the world refuses to do so." Grace nodded, her eyes misting slightly. "I have seen cruelty in the world too. Many assume I am weak because of my position, because I work with my hands. But I have learned to stand quietly, to hold dignity even when the world dismisses me." Daniel reached out with a gentle hand, not touching her but signaling connection. "That is courage," he said softly. "True courage is not loud. It does not need to shout. It stands quietly, and yet it moves mountains." Grace blinked back a tear, feeling understood in a way she had never expected. "I have never been called courageous," she whispered. "People think it is ordinary to endure, but to me it has always been survival. And survival," Daniel said with warmth, "is the foundation of strength. Those who endure quietly often hold more power than those who wield it openly." The diner grew quieter still. Most customers had left, leaving only a few stragglers and the attentive waitress. The rain's absence created a strange calm, a pause between the ordinary life outside and the extraordinary human moments inside. For a long while, they simply talked. Stories of childhood, of early struggles, of lessons learned in hard ways. Daniel spoke of the accident that had changed his life, of the pain of losing mobility, and the challenge of adapting to a world that often saw him as incapable. Grace shared stories of her children, the challenges of raising them while working long hours, and the pride she carried in their small victories. With each story, a quiet bond grew. Two lives so different yet so aligned in their understanding of endurance, dignity, and the small, meaningful victories of everyday life. Then, as Daniel was recounting a memory from his early days as an entrepreneur, the diner door opened with a gentle chime. A young boy stepped inside, dripping wet from the rain that had returned in a light drizzle. He glanced around nervously, holding a small umbrella that was more decorative than useful. Grace's eyes widened as she recognized him immediately.
"Ben, what are you doing out here?"
she exclaimed softly. The boy looked at her with worry. I wanted to find you. I forgot my homework at school and I thought maybe you could help me." Grace's heart softened. She gestured for him to come closer. "It's okay. Sit here with me." Daniel watched silently, observing the tenderness in Grace's interaction. She was no longer just a stranger in the diner. She was a mother, a protector, and a guide. The strength he had noticed earlier now unfolded in front of him in full. Ben climbed into the booth carefully, leaving his umbrella on the floor. Grace smiled at him, brushing damp hair from his forehead. "Don't worry, sweetheart. We will sort it out together." Daniel smiled quietly. He realized then that wealth and power could never replace the simple acts of care and love. Grace's quiet strength, her dedication to her children, and her ability to face life's challenges with dignity were more impressive than any empire he had built. The boy handed her the forgotten homework, and she helped him go over it quietly. Each word exchanged was filled with patience and love. Daniel noticed the calm authority in her tone, the reassurance she gave without raising her voice. For a moment, Daniel imagined his own life in parallel. He had employees and assistants, a staff of hundreds, yet how many truly cared for him? Who saw the person beneath the wealth? Rarely anyone. And here, in this small diner, Grace demonstrated a power he had never fully understood. Influence through care, respect, and presence. As Ben finished his corrections, Grace handed him a small piece of bread. "Eat this before you go back," she said softly. "And remember, no one can define you by what they see. Only you can define yourself." Daniel felt his chest tighten. Her words, simple as they were, carried a weight of truth he had long ignored in his own life. Respect, courage, and dignity could not be bought. They could only be earned and recognized in moments like these. The boy nodded, a small smile breaking through his nervousness. He waved at Daniel politely before leaving with Grace, the two of them stepping into the misty night, her umbrella held over both of them. Daniel watched them go, feeling a mixture of admiration and melancholy. Life had taught him that wealth could solve many problems, but it could not provide the kind of fulfillment he now witnessed. He realized that connection, respect, and compassion were rarer than any fortune. The waitress came by and cleared their table quietly, sensing that Daniel had experienced something profound. "It's amazing," she said softly. "Sometimes the smallest encounters change everything." Daniel nodded, lost in thought. "Yes," he murmured. "More than anything else, they do." He returned to his coffee, drinking it slowly. The diner now felt like a bridge between worlds, one of privilege, one of struggle, but connected by humanity. He realized that sometimes life arranged meetings not by accident but by design. That night, the meeting with Grace and her son was not merely coincidence. It was a reminder of what truly mattered. Hours passed. The diner emptied, leaving only Daniel and the waitress, who gave him a knowing look. He smiled faintly. "Thank you," he said, "for letting this place be a sanctuary tonight," the waitress nodded. "Sometimes we all need a place to just exist." Daniel wheeled himself to the door, pausing before stepping outside. The streets were wet, but the air felt cleaner now, lighter. He realized that the world, despite its cruelty and misunderstanding, still held moments of grace, courage, and connection. As he looked back at the diner one last time, he saw Grace's figure in the distance walking home with her son. There was dignity in every step, strength in every gesture, and a quiet bravery that would shape both their lives in ways that wealth or titles never could. That night, Daniel learned a lesson richer than any fortune. Power is fleeting, but kindness endures. Cruelty may strike, but courage and dignity remain. And strangers can become teachers, guiding us to see the beauty in life's simplest moments. And though the world outside would continue in its rush, in that quiet diner, two lives had intersected and left an imprint that would last far beyond a single rainy night. The city had fallen into a quiet rhythm. Streetlights reflected off the rain-soaked streets, and the soft hum of distant traffic filled the night. Inside the diner, the warmth lingered, though most of the tables were empty. Only Daniel remained, sipping slowly from his cup of coffee, reflecting on the events of the evening. He had watched Grace and her son disappear into the mist, their figures small but resilient against the darkened streets. Their presence lingered in his thoughts, not as strangers but as symbols of strength and perseverance he had not fully understood before. For Daniel, the night had been a lesson in humility. Wealth, power, and influence could never replace human connection. He had felt the sting of cruelty earlier, from three careless young men who had judged him without reason, and he had felt the warmth of kindness from someone unexpected, someone who carried far more than her hand suggested. Daniel's phone vibrated quietly on the table. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from his assistant. "Sir, your meeting tomorrow is confirmed. Are you all right after tonight?" He smiled softly. "Yes, better than all right. I am learning." He typed a quick reply, then leaned back in his chair. The diner had become more than a place to eat. It had become a place to reflect, to realize what truly mattered in life. Just then, the door opened again. Daniel looked up, expecting a stray customer, but instead, it was Grace. She paused at the entrance, shaking off the last drops of rain from her coat. Her eyes met Daniel's, and for a moment neither spoke. "Good evening," she said softly. "Good evening," Daniel replied, smiling. "Back so soon?" Grace nodded, stepping carefully to his table. "I realized I forgot something important," she admitted. "I wanted to thank you for noticing me tonight, for your kindness. It is not something I often receive." Daniel's heart swelled. "Grace, it is I who should thank you. You reminded me of what is truly valuable. Respect, dignity, courage, qualities no fortune can buy." She smiled faintly, the tired lines on her face softening in the light. "Sometimes the world is cruel, but in moments like these I see hope. You have reminded me of that." For a long time they sat together, speaking quietly, exchanging thoughts and reflections. The diner was empty now, the few remaining staff having finished their duties. But the warmth between them remained, stronger than the chill of the night outside. Daniel spoke of his childhood, of struggles before wealth had come, and of lessons learned the hard way. Grace shared stories of her life, of raising her children alone, of sacrifices made silently without recognition. Each story reinforced the bond forming between them. "I used to think strength was shown through power," Daniel said, his voice quiet, "through money, influence, and control. But tonight, I see strength differently. It is in endurance. It is in compassion. It is in the courage to be gentle when the world is harsh." Grace nodded. "I have learned the same. Life tests you in ways you cannot predict, but how you respond, that is what defines you." The conversation moved to future dreams. Daniel, despite his wealth, admitted he longed for something more than financial success. He wanted to create a world where people could be seen, respected, and valued for who they were, not what they possessed. Grace listened, inspired. "That is a rare vision. Many who have wealth forget the human side, but you have remembered." Daniel looked at her, sincerity in his eyes. "And you have reminded me that courage does not require grandeur. It does not need recognition. It exists quietly, in small acts and in the way you live your life." Grace felt a tear slip down her cheek, quickly brushed away. "You make it sound beautiful. The life we endure, the struggles we face, to see it as meaningful." Daniel reached out, placing his hand gently over hers across the table. "It is meaningful," he said softly. "More than anything else." Outside, the rain began again, a soft, steady drizzle. But inside the diner, there was no fear, no discomfort, only a growing sense of hope. The world could be cruel, but it could also be kind. The lesson of the evening was clear. Respect and kindness could triumph over ignorance and cruelty. As the night deepened, Grace and Daniel spoke of plans, small steps that could bring real change. Daniel, with his resources, could support causes that uplifted those often ignored by society. Grace, with her knowledge of everyday struggles, could guide him in understanding the needs of those who had little voice. "It is not about money," Daniel said. "It is about seeing people, giving them dignity, offering opportunities where none exist." Grace nodded, feeling a sense of purpose she had never imagined possible. "I would like to help," she said. "To make a difference even in small ways," Daniel smiled. "Together, we can do more than either of us could alone." For the first time that night, Daniel felt a true connection, not just to Grace, but to the world in a deeper sense. Life had handed him wealth, yes, but it had also handed him lessons he could only understand in moments like these. The evening had begun with cruelty and ended with understanding. The door of the diner opened again briefly, letting in a cold gust of air, but it held no fear now. The bullies were gone, their influence meaningless in the presence of true courage. Grace finished her tea, setting the cup down with a soft clink. "I should go," she said. "My boys are waiting. I cannot keep them up too late." Daniel nodded. "Of course. But remember, Grace, tonight you have changed more than you realize. Not just me, but the way I see the world." She smiled, feeling the weight of his words. "And you have reminded me of the value of my life and the strength I carry, even when others overlook it." They stood together, a quiet understanding passing between them. The diner, now nearly empty, had become a space of transformation. Daniel wheeled himself to the door. "Good night, Grace," he said softly. "Good night, Daniel," she replied. "And thank you for seeing me." Outside, the rain continued gently. The streets were quiet, the city asleep, but something had shifted. Two lives so different had intersected and left lasting impressions. The world would continue with its indifference and occasional cruelty. But in the hearts of Daniel and Grace, there was a new strength, a belief in kindness, courage, and dignity that would endure far beyond a single night. Daniel watched Grace walk away, her son beside her, holding her hand. He felt hope stir within him, a quiet promise that life, even after hardship, could bring meaningful connections. He realized that wealth without compassion was hollow, and power without understanding was empty. But together with those who carried quiet strength, he could make a difference. Turning back into the diner one last time, Daniel felt a sense of peace. The small space, the warm light, the lingering smell of coffee and pie, it had become more than a place to eat. It had been a crucible of understanding, a reminder that the heart of humanity often shines brightest in ordinary moments. He took a deep breath and wheeled himself out into the misty night. The city seemed calmer somehow, not because it had changed, but because he had. And as he disappeared into the rain, he carried with him a renewed sense of purpose, a memory of courage and dignity, and the knowledge that sometimes the smallest encounters hold the greatest meaning. And Grace, walking home with her son, felt it too. Her steps were lighter, her heart fuller, and her spirit stronger. She had been seen, valued, and respected, and in seeing Daniel, she had witnessed the quiet power of humility and the courage to rise above cruelty. That night, the world outside the diner continued as always. But in the lives of two ordinary people, one billionaire and one maid, extraordinary change had begun. Change not of fortune, but of perspective, of understanding, and of the quiet but unshakable belief that kindness, dignity, and courage would always endure. And so, the diner's neon sign flickered softly in the night, a small beacon of warmth in a world that could be harsh, a place where a billionaire learned humility, a maid discovered her value, and a single rainy evening became a turning point for two lives forever intertwined by fate, compassion, and the simple, enduring power of humanity.